So just take a moment to be impressed by the background here. All right. All right. Okay. So the paper is about carbon leakage by multinational firms. So just to kind of set the stage a bit, different countries have different environmental policies. And what we will be interested in doing here is looking at firms who are that are multinational, meaning that they have operations across different countries, and explore where their CO2 emissions are. Now, why multinationals? Well, multinationals are the largest economic players in terms of corporations. If you look at, just as an example, in 2017, 50% of the cross-border investment by multinationals was about 50% of GDP of OECD countries. So this is substantial. They also have existing infrastructure, so responding could be just easier for them. You know, if you're just a local firm, you know, doing something with your pollution activities is more difficult. For them, it's easier to shift if they wanted to shift activities. It's cheaper, and finally, their activities are easy to observe. These are oftentimes, or most times, public companies. They report they report their emissions, as I will discuss in a few moments. Now, so what do we kind of going kind of more deeply into the paper? We're going to use a novel panel data set that reports at the level of firm, country, year their CO2 emissions. So for each country, think about a country that works in firm that operates in 10 different countries. We will know in each country how much they emit, and also the emission is going to be, the CO2 emission is going to be on several categories, as I will discuss in a few moments. And basically, we'll try to answer how important are the home versus foreign environmental policies. Now, I'll preempt some of my discussants' comments right off the bat. This is not about randomized experiment or any clever identification in terms of a rule change, or we're going to have just slightly flavor of this, but it's going to be more a broad brush mapping. I mean, when we got access to the data, we kind of said, sometimes, when you look at these rule changes, you see kind of maybe the trees, but you don't see the wood. And we were interested in kind of just broad brush mapping, just, is there any correlation, or are they just to understand where the big picture in pollution? Maybe we could say something as economists there. So just to kind of what we're going to look at, we're going to look at the push versus pull. This is going to be, I think, one of the more interesting results here in terms of our is stricter environmental policy at home pushes you away, or are there like enticing countries that you want to emit there, and their lax environmental policy actually pull you to their country? So we'll talk about supply chains, and maybe we'll be able to say something about corporate governance and industry characteristics. But as you will see, there are a few caveats there. All right. So just to kind of quickly summarize the findings, I think that there is substantial evidence of carbon leakage, meaning that firms that are headquarters in countries with strict policies actually pollute less at home, at their home country, more abroad. And there is also outsourcing. There is evidence, and again, it's going to be a bit caveated, but there is evidence of outsourcing polluting activities along the upstream, basically to suppliers. And pollution is going to pollution abroad, called exporting pollution, is going to be higher when there is a bigger environmental policy gap between the home country and the foreign country. We also find that when you have a stricter domestic environmental policy, firms pollute less in total, but this effect seems to be kind of minor, and again, it's going to be a bit caveated, this result. We're talking about push versus pull. So strict domestic policies seem to push away pollution to other countries, as opposed to kind of pulling by foreign countries. If you think about third world countries, it's not. We don't see a lot of pulling by offering convenient policies for pollution, but rather it's the home country that push up. And finally, there might be some association, again, going to be caveated with about governance and pollution-intensive industries. But I should say, we don't find material results for pollution-intensive industries. Okay, let me start with the data. So we're going to have emission data per firm, per country, per year on 3 levels, or actually 2 levels, and the third one is going to be more. But the 2 levels are scope 1 and scope 2. Scope 1 are basically emissions being used directly by the firm. So the firm has manufacturing facilities. How much do they emit straight from these facilities? It includes also travel. It includes also any activities that the firm does. Scope 2 is the emission being done by the electrical and heating companies. If they use some third party, well, most firms use third party electricity, how much emission is done in this process. So these are kind of indirect energy being used to pollution that was done during this electricity. So it's going to be, for example, different firms will report different emissions if they used electricity coming from solar and wind power as opposed to fossil fuel, depending on their electricity supplier. And finally, so these 2 are going to be at the firm, country, year level. Finally, we know also for some of the firms, for about 40% of the firms, for a subset of the years, we have information about scope 3. Scope 3 is kind of going beyond it. It's basically about the inputs, about the emissions that were used in your inputs, about business travel, it's about commute, and all these kind of even more remote activities. We have information there only at the global level. So for each firm, we will know. So say Apple, we will know what's the total amount that they emitted in scope 3 in a particular year, but not broken down by country. All right. So the data comes from a CDP, Carbon Disclosure Project. So these are basically voluntary questionnaires that are being sent to public firms. And the reason that public firms spend time and money responding to these and they try to make it accurate is because these are used by institutional investors. And the CDP database is basically makes its living from selling this data to institutional investors who care about ESG. Some of the data is actually audited, and we have, as part of our robustness, we just run the main results for the audited subsample, and the results are very similar. Okay, so we have emissions to nearly 2,000 public firms across the globe. They are headquartered in 48 home countries, and they operate in over 200 foreign countries. Let's look, my daughter yells there. אמא לא בבית. היא הלכה the survey, the years for the survey are 2008 to 2015. And we have information at the firm country year, as I mentioned, for scope 1 and scope 2. For about 40%, we have information for scope 3 at the global level, firm year, but only for 5 years. Now, there is another issue with scope 3. Scope 3 is less standardized, so firms seem to kind of include different things sometimes in scope 3. So the result that I'll show you with scope 3 have this caveat that we feel less confident about them, but you know, this is the best we have. So this is one kind of important data set that we use. The second component is the environmental regulation index that comes from the World Economic Forum. And basically it has two components. One is about stringency of environmental policies. And the second one is enforcement. We combine these both, they are highly correlated, as you can imagine. We combine them to a single score, which we call SEER. It is an acronym. And basically higher means stricter. So both, it's going to be a multiplication of these two individual scores. And just to get a kind of an idea about how the data looks, what you see here on the right are basically the average fraction of, these are kind of like our main result, the average fraction of foreign emissions out of your global emissions per country as a function of SEER. So what you could see is that on the left you have the low environmental policies. Firms that are headquarters in Russia, India, Turkey, China, Colombia, Thailand, etc., are emit pollution, emit CO2 more at home as opposed to abroad. As you move to the right, you get to the more OECD countries. You know, we can see there Japan, New Zealand, Finland, Germany. The US is also somewhere here. US is 4 only. So for these countries, they emit more abroad. Now, obviously, this is just just summary statistics. In our regressions, we have controls for the for GDP, etc. I'll tell in a few moments, but the its relationship actually is conserved in regressions. I'm not sure whether this slide is optimistic or not. If you look at the difference in our environmental regulation score between 2008 and 2015, you know, it's changed but a bit. Okay. All right. So our first set of results, basically looking at you know, basically the relation that I showed you in this chart. If we look at how much you emit, we're going to have different categories, as you'll see in a moment. How much you emit as a function of your environmental regulation score at your home country. What we find is that firms that are headquartered in countries with strict environmental policy emit about 20% less, both scope 1 and scope 2. They emit much more, the effect is much larger, meaning they emit much less in their home countries, but emit much more in foreign countries. This is basically what you've seen in the univariate chart before. Okay. Now there are controls in the background. So basically, we control for the firm's size, the foreign asset shares in some of the. This variable is a bit missing, so in some of the regressions and some country home country variables like the GDP and GDP for, per capita growth. There are also industry and times year. Then we look at global emissions. So the question we're trying to ask here is whether there is an association between the environmental policies at home and your overall global emissions. And we find that firms that are well, actually, I showed you already that global emissions are lower by 20%. Sorry, it's too early here in Columbus, Ohio. So we'll try to ask the following question here in this analysis. We know what happens in scope 1, scope 2 that are kind of under the control. Scope 1 is directly under the control of the firm. Scope 2 is more is a direct input in a way, electricity, right? Scope 3 is about your suppliers, your business travel, or things that are kind of more remote. You have discretion, but it's somebody else. Somebody else is who pollutes. May not be under if I buy some inputs coming from a different country, it's not, even if in my country there is a strict environmental policy, it's not going to be taken against by my own company. So the question is, what we're trying to ask is, do firms in strict countries with strict environmental policies outsource more these kind of activities? So as I told you before, scope 3 is available only at the global level and only for some of the firms. So the first thing that we do is we just repeat our earlier global emissions regression for this subset of firms for this subset of years. And what we find is that this is what you see here in the first column. For this subset of firms, they use less of scope 1 emissions, about 24%. Before it was 20%. So they emit less at home. Now the question is, do they substitute along the supply chain? So we look at scope 3, and there is a positive yet insignificant effect of substituting away. So they use slightly statistically indistinguishable than zero more pollution along the supply chain. When we combine scope 1 and scope 3, kind of asking, okay, overall, do they substitute their own activities with scope 3? We find that the global emissions for these firms is actually halved than what we would estimate or what would look like if we just looked at their direct activities. So it seems that there is a bit of pushing some of your emission or towards firms upstream the supply chain. Okay, so we try to take advantage of the fact that we see where they emit. So we're going to look at the gap between the environmental policies at home versus the entire globe or all other countries. So we're going to ask, are you going to emit more in abroad when the policy gap is bigger? And this is what we find. We find that firms are more likely to emit in foreign countries when the gap, the policy gap between the home and the foreign country is larger. We talk about a couple of economic mechanisms. The first one that I think is the most interesting and important is the push versus pull. So if you think about so far I've shown you associations, right? I mean, these were correlations. There is a good reason that there are some omitted variables that we haven't controlled for, and that's the nature of the data. Right, so these are associations. The question is, can we say a bit more about whether whether countries actually push firms out by, is it the strict policy in the home country that pushes firms to pollute out, or are these foreign countries that actually pool, provide convenient environmental policies so that firms come to them, right? And you have in the environmental economic literature, the theoretical one, you have proposal for both mechanisms. So what we're going to do here is to use the Kawaja and Mian 2008 framework. So the idea is that because we have this interesting data structure of term, country, year, we can actually try and control for basically hold constant the policies of my my home country per year, and ask, does the variation in foreign countries' policies matter for firms headquartered in my year, and vice versa for the foreign firms. So let me just show the results, and hopefully it will be clearer. So what we're asking here, we're looking at the push effect. Do firms actually, do countries push away domestic firms to pollute elsewhere? And so here's what we do. We look at the left-hand side in these regressions is basically how much you emit in foreign countries. And we're going to have fixed effects for foreign country times year. Okay? So the variation is going to come, and we're going to control also for home country fixed effects. So the variation is going to come actually from variation over the years in your home country. Okay, so we're holding the home country fixed. We're holding all the foreign country times year fixed. So the variation comes from the variation here in the environmental policies at home actually come from a time variation in your home country. And what we find is that as this variation, as the environmental policies at home increase, there is, basically you send out more of your pollution outside. So this is what we call the push effect. When we look at the pull effect, we find no evidence. So the pull effect is going to be the reverse exercise. We're going to fix the home country and year policies and ask, does the time variation in foreign countries, in the policies of foreign countries, actually matter for firms that are housed in the home country? And we find basically no effect. It seems that what's going on here is that it's about the push. We also look at governance, which is conference. What we find is that there is a negative association. I should say, how do we measure governance? We basically use what institutional investors use. It's a Thomson Reuters asset4 database. And we use just the overall governance score, which basically is supposed to measure whether management acts on behalf of long-term investors or generate investors, investor long-term value. And we basically asked, do firms that are above the median, that is there a differential effect in terms of CR, in terms of the environmental policies? And what we find is that basically compared to compare above the median, below the median, they emit less at home and slightly less in foreign countries. Now,
sorry, Zahi, you have 5
yes,
minutes left.
5 minutes is lots of time. Thank you. So what we see here is that basically when there is a strong governance policy, they emit less at home. Obviously, this is open to reverse causality because this measure is based on includes also how you what's your emission policy. It's an ESG measure. But what's interesting is that it is focused on the home emissions. Even if you believe if you think it's a reverse causality, it has a different effect. It's much more impacted by the home as opposed to the foreign emissions. So maybe there is, if you believe in the reverse causality, then it's maybe even a story of window dressing. At home, you emit less, but you actually kind of, you don't care that much about foreign emission. You care, but not as much. The third and the last mechanism that we test, but we don't find very interesting results, is basically look at pollution-intensive industries. So these are industries that, based on just these are EU statistics, generate the highest emission per their activity, revenues, or assets. So what you could see here is that so basically what we do, we just look at, it's quite you could say that the first 6 are really, taking most of the pollution compared to other industries. So the idea was, if you're trying to design a policy that somehow targets CO2, you may want to start with the big polluters. I mean, there is little, if you have if you look at the bottom one, repair of motor vehicles or trading motor vehicles, just these are just just selling cars. Maybe there isn't much to do there. These are just parking lots with cars. You may want to put your efforts in the big polluters, for example, refineries or air travel. And what we find is that if we look at firms in the pollution-intensive industries, basically they pollute more, but basically they pollute the same in home, or pollute more in the same degree in home and foreign. So we don't see a lot of much of response or much of variation with respect to the environmental policies with respect to home or foreign. Okay, so let me just wrap up here. So we think that there is bad news in the sense that there is carbon leakage is real. There is evidence about more foreign pollution, more upstream pollution. We like a lot the idea of pushing. No, we don't find any evidence for pulling. And maybe there is a bit of good news that maybe strict policies are associated with lower global emission. And the overall message is that we need more collective action, because it's almost like you have to somehow having stricter policies at home alone is not going to help. It's just going to push it away. Then I found for you this. It's kind of the message in if you do what's in the bottom left, you're going to get less pollution. Okay. This is what I had for you guys.
Right. Thank you very much, Zahi, for the presentation on Sunday morning. The discussant is Per Strömberg from Stockholm School of Economics. Per, you have 10 minutes.
Great. Let's see. Okay. You see my screen?
Yes. Can you do
great.
screen? Perfect.
Okay. And you hear me as well?
Yes.
Okay. So great. So well, thanks to the organizers for letting me discuss this paper. Thanks myself. Okay. So I think this is obviously a very important policy issue, as the problem with climate change is that it doesn't matter where you emit your CO2, it has an identical effect on climate change. So even if we in Sweden have very strict carbon tax and so forth, if the Swedish companies just move their manufacturing to some country where they can pollute without paying tax, we have basically no effect on the climate change. So this is what is referred to as carbon leakage. Okay, so this paper is basically trying to find evidence of carbon leakage. Okay, so Zai went through all the results. I don't think I need to spend so much time on these, but basically the one of the challenges here is obviously has to do with data. They use these CDP data which I assume are basically driven by firms report how much CO2 they emit, and the reason they do it is basically driven by investors. So this is public firms that are sort of disclosing the CO2 emissions, and then I guess investors use them to decide, where they want to invest, to take into account ESG in their policies. So and then they combine this with data on how strict the policy is, which is from the WEF or World Economic Forum survey, and then financial data. And then what they basically find is that, if you increase the strictness of your domestic climate regulation, you see a drop of 29% in your home country emissions, but you see an increase of 43% in your foreign emissions. So this is basically a carbon leakage indication. And you see a slight drop overall in your total emissions. And then there are various other results that Zahi went through. So I guess, one of the questions probably, you have, at least I had just initially, okay, is it good news or bad news? Because on the one hand, you do see a net effect on total emissions of domestic policy. So maybe you could actually declare victory there and say, even if this is a global problem, it actually does matter what you do in your home country, because there isn't at least complete carbon leakage. On the other hand, there seems to be quite a bit of carbon leakage. Okay. Now, to my comments here, one thing that I think we need to think a little bit about is what we mean with carbon leakage and how it's measured in the paper. So I think the at least one sort of very intuitive way to think about carbon leakage is, okay, so I start, there's two countries here. Okay, so I have some dirty establishment, and I have a cleaner establishment at home. Here's my production facilities maybe, and my sales facilities, and then my home country tightens CO2 policy. Okay, so to avoid whatever CO2 tax, I just move my dirty production to a country that has more lax policies, and I really haven't reduced total emissions a lot. Okay, so this is sort of what we're after in the paper, and I guess the results, some of the results are consistent with this behavior. However, there are other things that could happen as well. Okay, so take the following example. So remember that the dependent variable, what we're looking at here, is one of the variables looked at least is percent of emissions that you do abroad. Okay, so take the following situation. Okay, before emissions, a dirty establishment, both home and abroad. I'm a multinational. After tightening, I clean up my domestic, establishments, where I have to do it because I'm facing carbon tax, for example. I don't do anything to my foreign ones. Okay, so at least in one of the measures they're using, percentage foreign emissions would go up in this case, but I wouldn't probably call this carbon leakage because I've actually have reduced my my domestic emissions. Now you could say, well, but they also look at total emissions, but then you have another issue, I guess, which is take this this issue, same thing as before. Okay, so after this tightening of regulation, I clean up my domestic businesses, and the firm is also at the same time growing. Okay, so here you would actually have kind of both the percentage and the amount of foreign emissions going up, but I'm really becoming a cleaner company. Okay, so it's going to be very important to sort of control for these things. I think more generally, people or researchers in environmental economics have thought quite a bit about how to sort of think about changes in emissions. Just copied an equation from a paper by Levinson. So if you think about total pollution for a given firm, okay, you can think about that as, let's say they have establishments in a couple of different countries. Okay, so you could decompose this basically into this last thing here, which is, it depends on your total scale and how much how big you are. It depends on how much you're producing relatively in different countries, and it depends on how pollution intensive your business is in these different countries or industries or whatever, right? So you could increase emissions because you grow, because of scale. Conditional on scale, you could change because of different composition across countries, across business lines. And you could, and this I guess is what we're after, if we want to get a cleaner world, you could reduce conditional on composition and scale. You could actually reduce emissions because you use better technology. And in the paper currently, I'm a little sort of confused about which one of these it is, right? So if you find that the foreign emissions increase, is it because you move dirty production abroad, which is, I guess, what we would call leakage? Or maybe you're growing faster in countries where you happen to have dirtier divisions. Okay, so then I don't know if we call that leakage or not. Maybe you chose to invest more in those countries, in which case maybe we can call it leakage, but maybe it's just because that market grew faster. You could actually be improving your technology more at domestic plants, plus you grow overall, which was the last example I showed in the picture, and that I definitely wouldn't call leakage. Okay, so I think I would push the authors to try a little bit to think about decomposing the effects in this way. Now, one of the challenge, and I'm very sympathetic, by the way, that this is, you have the data you have, and the data is interesting, but it's not perfect, and you can't do a perfect sort of identification, QG type exercise here. However, let me just point out some things that are a little problematic. So these surveys, the emission data comes from these surveys that are basically pushed for by investors, as I understand it. The coverage has increased a lot over time. Okay, so this is really a very highly unbalanced panel. It's very unclear to me how the composition, to what extent these decreases in emissions on average come from different industries being included, different countries being included versus actually reductions. And then if you look to the right, even if you had a panel, there isn't so much going on, at least if you look at the averages of changes in policy over time. So there's not a ton of power in doing sort of a a diff and diff, even if you had a perfect panel here. So I think doing a proper diff and diff here is challenging, and that also means that these regressions can't have firm fixed effects in it. You try to do the best you can to control for firm characteristics and so forth, but we're not talking about within firm changes necessarily in these tests.
Sorry, Per, you have 1 minute left.
1 minute, okay. So then I do think that this is sort of along the same lines. I think we're interested in emission intensities here. Are you sort of investing in using better technology? Is there, so trying to do more on that, I would encourage you to do. I think you mentioned scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. I think the scope 1 emissions is really the one that's sort of informative in this exercise about what the firm is doing. Scope 2, you have a problem. That's basically the energy you're using. It could simply be that if you have a change in policy in the country, that affects actually the utility firms and what kind of electricity they offer, which will then change the scope 2 emissions of a given firm, but not because they did anything, it's because their suppliers of electricity were forced to do stuff. Scope 3 is interesting in principle, but data is very poor. One thing to also note here is that your results that there is not much reduction in pollution intensive industries is a little sad, because it turns out that the pollution intensive industries, 7% of the firms here account for more than 50% of emissions. So that no action in pollution intensive industries is actually pretty bad news. Final thing here that I do think is somewhat important on these country firm year level regressions, there is a tendency of strict policy firms up here in the right-hand corner to be quite small countries, and a lot of the large countries, this is now emissions, but I think it correlates pretty well with the size of the market and the size of sales in these countries. You see a lot of the big markets tend to be dirtier, and a lot of the small markets tend to be clean, and that's a problem if you think about these. Sweden has a stricter policy. At the same time, if Swedish firms are growing, they kind of have to grow in these dirty countries because that's where they can sell stuff. So I think you potentially could have some spurious relationships there. So anyway, that's my comments. Sorry for going over a bit. I think it's an interesting paper, definitely on a very important issue. So I think I had more patience with methodology since the issue is so important. And there are a lot of data limitations that restrict what you can do, but maybe there's some more things that you can do here. Final word is think about colorblind people who can't distinguish red from brown like me. But anyway, that's what I had.
All right, thank you, Per. Zahi, would you like to respond? And then we have some questions from the panelists. Maybe we can take those from David.
Yes, all right. So thank you very much, Per. I well appreciated and our good comments. I don't have an answer to all of them, but it definitely gave me some ideas of other things we could do. So, for example, you mentioned the growth, maybe uneven growth between domestic and foreign. So one of our variables that we have that we maybe could use is the percent of foreign assets. So maybe we could do something with that.
Do you have sales by country or only assets?
No, only assets.
Okay, that's too bad. Because I guess there's some interesting differences between sales and assets.
No, and I think in many of these are the production facilities. Think about cars, right? I mean, so the production is done somewhere else. The assembly is the design is. I mean, each country has its own kind of.
Yeah. So if you had country level sales as well as country level assets, you could actually directly see if it's due to outsourcing of manufacturing facilities versus just different sales in those countries.
Yeah, as far as I know, we don't have this. Probably there is something we could do to check at least whether the unbalanced panel is responsible. Maybe there is something about weighting by country, kind of evaluating, just to check whether there is anything spurious going on there. Yeah, but these are, I mean, the composition, I think, is something that we probably could do more. And to some extent, I think we do have some results, because we see the change in the domestic, the change in the foreign, and the change in the percentage. So we could probably do more in terms of interpreting these results. There are some questions in the I see in the chat here.
Yeah.
Do you want me to answer these, or what should I do?
So I think David has a question. So maybe we can go with David's question first, and
Yeah,
then
please.
maybe we take the other questions privately.
Okay, hello everybody. So my question was, so I mean that kind of leakage can happen within multinationals, but I would imagine it also happens, across firms. Like, I'm, having, another firm I'm importing from. So instead of having my own factory that is dirty in my country, I will use, another company to basically buy the, which I'm gonna buy the goods from, that is in a, kind of in a dirty country, or that is a dirty company abroad, and that you could check by using sort of the same data at the country level. No, if I'm in a country, so is it the case that I see an increase in pollution in countries that tend to export to countries that have an increase in their regulation of environment or something like that? That would be like a sort of the same regressions as the one you run.
So this is really the scope 3 that we have. So the scope 3 is how much the pollution that went into my inputs.
Yeah, but you could do it using other. What I'm saying is that you don't even need your WEF data. Is what I'm saying. You could do it with trade data.
Right, and so maybe there we should do a better job in relating to the literature, because with trade data, we're not the first ones kind of thinking about this idea of leakage, right? I mean, there is a 20-year. Sorry, maybe I should have again. So there is quite a bit of literature about carbon leakage, but the carbon I should have done. I'm sorry. The existing literature looks at exactly what it looks at. FDIs, looks at trade imbalances. Everything is at the aggregate level. There's nothing at the firm level. There's no firm level information.
Okay.
Oftentimes, CO2 is CO2 is approximated by the amount of industrial output, for example, as opposed to kind of actually measuring CO2. So the advantage here is really the data. It's CO2 and firm level. That hasn't been before. I should have. It's a bad.
But you still have an issue of sort of, okay, are you decreasing CO2 because you're sort of shutting down operations and we can't grow anymore, and then are maybe other firms picking up that slack and so forth, right? So that's, I think, is also along the lines, depends a little bit on competitive pressure and so forth. If we kill off all the Swedish firms, steel firms, and then the Indian ones pick up the slack, have we really done much for climate and so forth? Which I think this other literature is also.
Yeah. So maybe there is something more to do in the aggregate. And then if we look at aggregate, the issue of unbalanced panel is really important, because we're aggregating across different terms. Yeah. I mean, I need to figure out how to address this. But thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So in the interest of time, I suggest that we skip the break and go directly to the second paper.